Starfleet Academy has been cancelled, and it prompted me to produce this video telling you about what I don't like about Starfleet Academy. Look, this is my first video on this channel, and I'm going to talk about all things Star Trek, what I love, what I hate, what I think they missed. And Starfleet Academy, I think, was a missed opportunity. You know, I'm not a fan of most of what Alex Kurtzman has put out. I think the storytelling's weak. I think the sets and the visual effects are incredible, but the storytelling is weak. And to be fair, a 10-episode run with such big cast, it's pretty much guaranteed that we're not really going to invest in these characters. And so when you look at Caleb, like, his whole journey just moved too fast for me, and we didn't get to like him, know about him. He seemed to have a gazillion answers. You remember that, where he's the debating episode where he's basically knowing Starfleet regulations inside out. It all just felt like thrown together. And so we didn't see his development. We didn't get invested in him. And then we come to, you know, Holly Hunter's character, Nala Ake. She was aloof for me as a character. She was just off and random. And again, the character development was poor. And I do wonder whether there's just too many characters in these series to actually develop any of them. So, and you know, the not wearing shoes, the casual posing, I get it could be she's 400 plus years old, and so she's not playing by those rules anymore. And I get that if we'd have got to know her better, but most of her 400-year journey was just dialogue. We didn't get any sense of the years behind her. It was just like, and I think this is the problem with a 10-episode run. You don't get to know everybody. Jaden. I didn't like the character. I didn't like the skirt. I didn't like it because it was too much change to a reintroduction of Klingons. So, you know, the gay Klingon thing isn't so much of a big deal. The skirt, I think, just like when you've got a race as iconic as the Klingons that has spent 60 years building them up as a warrior race, 60 years of all of that canon been built, and you want to surprise people with something a bit different. I think what they did is, the mistake they made is, rather than taking us on the journey, because again, it's 10 episodes. I keep coming back to this 10-episode run thing, and I'm trying to be fair to it. A 10-episode run really makes it like hard to go along with this guy. This guy is really shy, withdrawn, and timid and awkward, and very much not like a Klingon. And then we've got the two dad family. Then we've got, he's gay. Then we've got the skirt, and he becomes defined by his sexuality, by his dress, by his parents, but we don't know him. And so it's hard to champion for somebody that you really don't know. So I think overall the character issues are clear. The story was bad. The story of, okay, Caleb separated from his mother. Nala Ake feels obliged. She feels bad that this all happened. I mean, Nala Ake was doing her duty. Number one, Caleb's mum was involved in a murder and theft, so she was doing her duty. I think the nuance that was lost in that story is that she promised something different. She promised them clemency or whatever as an informant, and actually she ended up in jail. And so Nala Ake felt guilty for that happening when she did something else, but she was a criminal. So she was a criminal. I can understand why Caleb's mother actually felt, you know, anger and betrayal towards Nala Ake because of that expectation that she was going to get off for informing. So I get that whole thing. I get the regrets of Nala Ake, get all of that. But then I still don't get the Newsbracker thing. Like, he wasn't a dumb guy. So him at the end, or in the trial, it coming out that it was his own father that destroyed his planet. Like, he was a grown-up to understand that. And this petty criminal, this pirate going on this big, grand conspiracy just didn't make sense for me. And that whole thing, most of the time, I was wondering, where is Paul Giamatti? Why is he not in this series? If he's going to be the big bad guy, we don't really know much about him. Again, 10 episodes, lack of time to actually develop anybody. So it felt like Paul Giamatti's character was a bad guy for a bad guy's sake, and that the anger, revenge, the attack on the Federation, the mines, I'll come to the mines, just was over the top. It was way too much for what happened. He killed somebody. Like, why has he now got this big, huge piece to play? The mines obviously made no sense whatsoever, and the Okudas are sadly missed in Star Trek. Those people who actually advise them and go, oh, wait a minute, hundreds of mines, how does this work? Didn't seem to make sense. Well, it didn't make sense. I think Nerdrotic actually said that it didn't make sense. The maths of it didn't work, that you could surround the entire Federation with mines, they wouldn't notice, and that you could build it. You could do it with hundreds of mines. So the storytelling, the story, the characters, Star Trek has a scientific edge. And so when things don't add up, it annoys people. And I know there's a lot of people saying, it was a great show. I think they're just trying to defend something for their own reasons. If you look at it, actually, the characters were underdeveloped. There was probably too many characters to develop. Discovery had the same thing, that actually, despite having 5 seasons, you still struggled to remember some of the people and why they mattered. Academy had huge numbers of people and struggled to make them develop, the story was just weak. It really was weak, both in terms of developing the story across the episodes, but also in terms of it did not make sense. The story did not make sense. The visual effects were incredible. One thing you can say for Alex Kurtzman is the sets, the visual effects are out of this world. But on the whole, I can see why it was cancelled. It was cancelled because Paramount, Secret Hideout want to bring Star Trek to new audiences, and they're trying to modify what Star Trek is to a new audience, and I get that, but it's landing flat. And I still don't get why there was so much momentum for Legacy and they didn't do it. And I do wonder whether that's some of it is ego there. But also the 32nd century piece, I think it feels so far away from Star Trek that we know that the fans struggle with it too. So the core fan base, the people who'll buy anything and watch anything like me, we're struggling with it because it's so far removed from the Star Trek we know. So I watched the Decon Chamber podcast this morning with Robert Picardo, and I thought he made some really good points about, it has to move on and it has to progress. And I get that. But I think if we're honest and we look at the story, it was a big story. It was a lot of characters to develop in 10 episodes. If I'm honest, I just want more TNG. Now, I know that's probably not going to be what the studios want to do, but I missed the space exploration. I missed the new worlds and all that kind of stuff. Don't get me wrong. I love Strange New Worlds. I love Lower Decks. There was moments of Discovery that I quite liked, but I miss the space battles, the exploring new worlds. I miss the episodic nature of Star Trek. But if I separate all of what I think, I still think those fundamentals were weak. It was a lot of visual effects that were brilliantly executed, poor story, too many characters, and it wasn't grounded. So I can see why it's been cancelled, and I can see why not many people have watched it, and I can see why Paramount's pulled it, because sets have to be dismantled, all that kind of stuff have to kind of happen, and so they have to call it quick, because every day that they leave it, it's costing them to leave the sets up, and they need to break it down and let that studio space that they're using to film it go to somebody else. So it is sad for Star Trek. I hope that actually, I'll just leave one more, and maybe I'll talk about this with another video. I think the danger, Rick Berman, when Rick Berman was running Star Trek, he did very, very well running TNG and DS9 and Voyager and Enterprise, but it ran its course and he hit well with TNG. I think, to be fair to Alex Kurtzman, it's much more difficult to make a show work in 2026 as in versus 1986 or 1996. So he has a harder job. But I think because the special effects weren't as good, the story had to be better. And I think the failing that Secret Hideouts made is they thought that the special effects, the wow of that, could compensate, and they didn't put enough into the story. I don't know. I'd love to hear what you thought of Academy. I don't want to turn the comments into a kind of, Trek Wars or new Trek versus old Trek. But I think we do have to be honest and say this did not hit all the marks. And too many characters, too few episodes to actually do what they wanted to do. And the story and the writing just wasn't good.